Each Amidah in the Modim prayer toward the end of the Shemona Esrei, we read these words, V'al kulam, for all of these things, Yitbarach v'yitormam shemcha malkeinu tamid le'olam ve'ed, may your name be praised and exalted, our sovereign, ever and always. Today's teaching is dedicated to the memory of Esther Kanterman, and God willing, Fran Kanterman is joining us virtually today. This past week was Esther's third yahrzeit. Tonight begins my sister Wendy's second yahrzeit, and so I'd like to dedicate today's teaching to the memory of two strong women, both of whom were a little contrarian in their own ways. And today's teaching also grows out of a partnership between Fran and myself over many years, but especially the past several weeks where we've been working on this Midrash that I'm going to share with you. The Midrash is about the Akeidah, not this week's parasha, so you'll forgive me for dwelling less on Bo and more on perhaps some of the questions of how God works in the world, which are a thread that runs through both parshiot and really the entire Torah, perhaps religiosity in general. And we might, in contemplating the story of the binding of Isaac, ask a difficult question, which is, with regard to magnifying and glorifying and praising God, as I just mentioned from the Amida, what do we do? And that seems to come in some sort of tension with our experience of God in the world or with human suffering. We don't need to look far to find examples of human suffering in this world. Suffering that comes about most often by human hands, and we might be asking, what is God's role in all of that? Why is it that when we lose someone, either at a ripe old age, as the rabbis would say, after a long life, or at a very young age, as I see Robin and Larry, who lost their daughter just recently? What do we do with loss and then proclaim Yitkadav v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah? God's name is exalted. How do we square that circle? So here's what I'd like to do. I don't think we're going to come up with a simple answer to that question, but I want to read through with you the Akeidah, which you'll find on page 117 in the Chumash if you still have it. I'm not going to spend time unpacking the Akeidah itself, but what I want to do is invite you to do a close read of the text, because when we look at the Midrash, you'll see that the Midrash is really very closely anchored in this text. So here it is, probably familiar to most of us. Vahi achar hadvarim ha'ela. Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he responded, Hineni, here I am. And he said, and you'll forgive the gendered language, I'm just going to read the text here. Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, you stay here with the ass. The boy and I will go up there. We will worship, and we will return to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife, and the two walked off together. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father, and he answered, Yes, my son. And he said, Here are the firestone and the wood, and where is the sheep for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son. And the two of them walked on together. They arrived at the place of which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac He laid him on the altar on top of the wood, and Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." And he answered, "Hineni, here I am." And he said, "Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me." When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that site Adonai Yireh, whence the present saying, "On the mount of the Lord there is a vision," or there is vision. So every other week, I go to visit Fran Kanterman at her place at the Colonnade. Those of you who know Fran know her to be a talented attorney, a leader in the Jewish community who helped develop the Odessa partnership with Baltimore and chaired that partnership and was very involved in it for many years. Fran has multiple sclerosis, and she has been bedbound for almost 2 decades now. And so Fran relies on the technology of our streaming service long before COVID to be able to join us. I don't judge how often she's coming to shul any more than I judge how often you're coming to shul, so I don't know how often she's here and how often she's not, but I know she enjoys being with us in our community when she's able to be. And you might imagine that Fran and I have conversations from time to time about theodicy, about human suffering, about God's role. And Fran, in addition to thinking about those things, of course, is remembering her mother, with whom she was very close. And Fran had been carrying with her this idea for years and years that she wanted to tell a different kind of story about the Akeidah. And she had some kind of basic elements to this in her head that she had been thinking about. And in the past couple years, we've been learning together. We learned for years and years, but in the past couple years, we've been learning from a book called Dirshuni, which is a collection of modern midrashim written by Israeli women. It's really extraordinary. I'm actually thinking of teaching a class on it, perhaps even this semester. Eva made that suggestion, so I'll get back to you on that soon. And Fran and I, as we're making our way through this, would sometimes talk about the different midrashic takes of these particular women on the Torah and her own take on this particular section of the Torah. And I suggested to her, well, maybe we should actually put it down on paper. And she thought that was a really good idea, so I brought my laptop, and for several weeks now, we've been working on this Midrash. So this is Fran Kanterman's take on the Akeidah, with my kind of participation, but very much growing out of her vision and her grappling with these big questions about the role of men and women, about the power structures of the Torah and of the patriarchy in general, I would say, about the relationship between us and God and God's expectations of us, about the question of human suffering. All these things are bound up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read it through twice. I'll read it once through just to give us a chance to hear it, and then I'll go once more through just to point out a few things and our thinking as we put these words down on the page. The last thing I want to say before we actually read it is that for those who are a little less familiar, there are different forms of Midrash. So Midrash is the interpretive tradition around our written primary sources, our Sifrei Kodesh. There are halachic midrashim, Midrash halacha, that deal with law. There's what's called Midrash Agadah that deals with narrative. And then within Midrash Agadah, there are different forms of Midrash. And a couple of those different forms are, one is called exegetical Midrash, where essentially you're going verse by verse, and then there's an explanation of that verse that the rabbis add A good example of that might be in the Passover Haggadah, right? The long Midrash in the Maggid section, that's an exegetical Midrash where you're essentially taking a verse and then explaining the verse, and then taking a verse and explaining the verse. Very much out of context, you might say, in that case. But you start, Arameo Vedavi, my father was a wandering Aramean, and then you have an explanation of how that applies to the Exodus, and it goes on and so forth. Another kind of Midrash is what's called homiletical Midrash, and within that there's something called the Petichta, which is where the Midrash starts with a kind of opening verse, which may come from a very distant part of Tanakh, and then the Midrash will sort of work its way back to that, or maybe it comes from pretty close to it. So this Midrash is, I would say, a kind of a hybrid of those two forms of Midrash. It's a homiletical Midrash, but it has elements of exegetical Midrash, and you'll see it starts with a verse which doesn't come from the Parsha of the Akeidah. It actually comes from the next Parsha. So it starts, and Sarah died. Those words are the very beginning of Parashat Chayei Sarah, the Parsha that follows Vayera, the Parsha that includes the Akeidah, the binding of Isaac's story. So it's in Medias Res is probably the closest kind of narrative idea or a framework story, right? So you're starting with the end or the middle, and then we're kind of working our way to that. Here it is. And Sarah died. Sarah's handmaids overheard and relayed to her the instruction God had given to Abraham. Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. He's going to kill my only son, Sarah exclaimed. What can I do? I can't talk to my husband. He's crazy with his God. So Sarah gathered supplies, took a male sheep from the flock, and followed Isaac to the land of Moriah. The journey was long and arduous, but her fear of what Abraham might do was always with her. On the third day, Sarah looked up and saw her son from afar. She heard Abraham say to his servants, "Stay here with the ass. The boy and I will go up there. We will worship, and we will return to you." She watched the man take the wood for the burnt offering and put it on her son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife. Sarah stifled a cry as the two walked off together. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood, and Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Sarah screamed, "Abraham, Abraham." And he answered, "Hineni, here I am." And she said, "Do not raise your hand against my boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you love God more than your son." Sarah sent forth the sheep, which bleated on its way to the altar. When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon the sheep. So Abraham untied Isaac, went and took the sheep and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of the boy. Sarah, meanwhile, carried her child home to Kiryat Arba. The angel of the Lord called to Sarah from heaven and said, "I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of the heaven and the sands on the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants." Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Isaac lived, but Sarah died of a broken heart. Later, Abraham would tell himself that an angel of the Lord stayed his hand and sent a ram in place of his son. But in reality, it was a sheep from his own flock, sent by Isaac's mother to save him. So, a couple of things as we go through this. You'll notice that the text really borrows very closely from the Mikra, from the original text, and also inverts some of the expectations we may have of it. Now, some of those inversions are actually very much in keeping with the classical Midrashic tradition. So it's not a given that the rabbis accept this on face value. And they ask all kinds of questions about Abraham and his faith. Some that say that this is about reinforcing Abraham's faith. Some that say that Abraham actually goes too far and God doesn't want child sacrifice at all. And actually, Abraham has to be brought back from the precipice. The reason that Abraham's name is called a second time when the angel calls out, and only one time, the first time, is because Abraham was so sort of hell-bent on going through with this that God had to say, no, I really don't want this. So it's not that Fran's more subversive read of the text is wholly without precedent, and at the same time, she does some really novel and I think really interesting things with the source material. So you'll see, for example, that the blessing which goes in verse 17 to Abraham in the text, Fran takes it out of there and places it as a blessing for Sarah and not for Abraham. We'll see a couple of other things. So let's go through it one more time. And Sarah died. Sarah's handmaids overheard and relayed to her the instruction God had given to Abraham. So, interestingly, we don't hear anything about handmaid or handmaids in this section of the Torah, but of course we know that Sarah does have handmaids, Hagar being the famous one, and so Fran kind of envisions this idea that there are other women who are in her court, as it were, and that they might play some important role in informing on Abraham to Sarah, who is not privy to any of the conversations between God and Abraham. Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. And then we get Sarah's voice, which of course doesn't exist within the story, though we have some indication that Sarah's voice is absent, maybe deliberately absent from the story, from the way that we move into Sarah's death right afterwards. And also it seems that Sarah ends up geographically in a different location from Abraham. And so Isaac and Abraham never talk again. Sarah and Abraham never seem to talk again. That's in the source material. So he's going to kill my son, Sarah exclaimed. What can I do? I can't talk to my husband. He's crazy with his God. And it was important to Fran to have the possessive there, with his God. So Sarah gathered supplies, took a male sheep from the flock, and followed Isaac to the land of Moriah. The journey was long and arduous, but her fear of what Abraham might do was always with her. So we have the experience of Sarah during this terrifying moment. The POV, as it were, the point of view shifts from Abraham really to Sarah's experience of this entire thing, and we can kind of imagine Sarah covertly sneaking behind her husband and her son, wondering what she can do to prevent this the entire while on this long 3-day journey. On the third day, Sarah looked up and saw her son from afar. You remember Abraham was the one looking up. Now we have Sarah looking up. She heard Abraham say to his servants, "You stay here with the ass." This is a quote from the Torah. "The boy and I will go up there, we will worship, and we will return to you." And now Sarah's point of view again. She watched the man take the wood for the burnt offering and put it on her son Isaac. You notice the word "the man" as a descriptor here. And her son, very deliberate. Not his son, but her son. He himself took the firestone and the knife. Sarah stifled a cry as the two, meaning not her, walked off together. And then we have another quote from the Torah. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood, and Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. And here we have, I think, the most kind of subversive element of this is the angel no longer exists in the story, and instead of the angel's voice, we have Sarah's voice. Now, there's actually some pretty good precedent for this, too, in our tradition. And what's beautiful about this collection, Dir Shuni, and really the Midrashic tradition, ancient and modern, is that it doesn't try to run roughshod over the text. It actually tries to embrace even the more counterintuitive elements of the interpretive tradition. And so one aspect of that hermeneutical process is that an angel is not just an angel, the way we think of an angel. A malach An angel can be an angel like a heavenly being, but a malach, an angel, can also be a human being. And we have examples of malachim in the Torah who are clearly not meant to be divine, but seem to be playing some sort of a divine role. And so it's not without precedent to say that Sarah playing the role of angel is actually very much in keeping with the tradition. Sarah now calls out Abraham, Abraham, and the text is identical. He responds, "Here I am." And she says, right, the words that the angel said, but now adjusted to make it appropriate coming from her. "Do not raise your hand against my boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you love God more than your son." And when Fran and I kind of landed on this language, I felt a chill. Because for me, that opened up a new understanding of this text, one that I hadn't quite thought of before. Sarah sent forth the sheep. She'd planned ahead, you see, which bleated on its way to the altar. When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon the sheep. You'll see this language is very much the same as that of the ram. So Abraham untied Isaac, went and took the sheep and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of the boy. The choice there, very deliberate. And now we have the parting of ways, which is in the text, as I said, but we make it explicit. Sarah, meanwhile, carried her child home to Kiryat Arba. The angel of the Lord called to Sarah from heaven. Here comes the blessing, which originally was given to Abraham for his demonstration of faith, but now goes to Sarah. "I will bestow my blessing upon you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands of the seashore, and your descendants shall seize the gates of their foes. All the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by your descendants." And then, and we talked about this a little bit, right? What do we do with Sarah's death? Because she is going to die, and it may have nothing to do with this text. This is what the rabbis call smichut parshiot. It's a connecting of one parsha with another. It doesn't mean that necessarily that verse from chapter 23 is temporally, chronologically connected with the end of chapter 22, but it's a common association. Why is it that Sarah dies, or that we're told Sarah dies in this very moment? And Fran felt that it was important to stick with that, so much so that we put this scene actually at the very beginning of our Petichta, that Sarah dies, and now we've worked back to that moment of Sarah's death. Why does Sarah die? Because she has a broken heart, and yet her son was saved, and she was the one who saved him. And I'm going to leave that open for you to think about. Why is it that Sarah would still die of a broken heart, even though in some measure you could say the story has a happy ending? And then we have the move at the end. Later, Abraham would tell him that an angel of the Lord stayed his hand and sent a ram in place of his son. But in reality, it was a sheep from his own flock sent by Isaac's mother to save him. So I'll close with this. I began with this question of what does it mean to exalt and praise God when dealing with trauma and loss, suffering, whether it's the suffering we see around the world, the suffering in Israel, the suffering in Gaza, in Ukraine, in Sudan, whether it's the suffering in this country under this new administration, that's already begun, and that which no doubt is on its way. Perhaps our own personal stories of loss. My sister was 43 years old when she died. And I think about my nephew Logan and my brother-in-law and what they've had to endure these past 2 years. There aren't simple answers to these questions. But what I love about what Fran and I were able to do here is I think in some small measure, the Midrash trades our perhaps judgment of condemnation of God with perhaps placing the blame more squarely where it belongs, and that's on Abraham. And in that sense, her Midrash redeems God. So at the beginning of the story, we have God calling out to Abraham, and by the end of the story, we have God blessing Sarah, and Abraham is the one who seems to be condemned by his wife, perhaps by his son. Is he redeemable? Maybe. maybe not. We don't know much about what happens after this. But in a way, I do think, if not letting God entirely off the hook, it does leave us with the capacity to worship a God who doesn't want the death of innocents and does want the rescuers, does want those who can to speak up and to stand up and to stop human beings from causing harm to other human beings. Halavai. Teni hiratzon. That should be God's will, and I'd like to think that it is. Shabbat shalom.